Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre and this afternoon's Text in the City program. My name is Lili Wilkinson. I am a young adult author and academic. Today we will be talking about Anna Funder Stasiland, and here to talk with me about it is Melinda Harvey. Melinda lectures in English at Monash University and is also a regular book reviewer for The Australian, The Age, The Sydney Morning Herald and Australian Book Review. Melinda, welcome.
Thank you.
All right, let's start off, and there's so much to talk about with this book that I'm sure we will not even remotely be able to cover in the time that we have, but tell us a little bit about how you first came across Stasiland.
I first read it in 2004, so that's 2 years after it was released. It was released in 2002, and it was already by that stage quite a big success. I believe it was into its second edition and I think second reprinting by then. I was working in a bookshop in Sydney at the time, and it was going great guns in this particular bookshop, and was being picked up by quite discerning customers. And so I kind of had it in my mind, but at the time I was finishing off my PhD and I wasn't allowed to read anything off topic. So that's why there was this delay from the time of its release, 2004. And I suppose the kind of immediate cause of me picking it up was after my thesis was finished, I rewarded myself with a trip to Europe, and I spent some time in Berlin. I'd been to Berlin in 1996, around the same time as Funder is living in her Lino palace, and was struck by what Berlin was like. And maybe some of you in the audience visited Berlin in that time. It was just this massive construction site. And then going back in 2003, the construction work was still going on, but things had settled down. And I, at this time, stayed in the East. I had a week in the East. I'd always been fascinated with Germany. I'd studied a bit of German at university. And as a teenager, I was really into World War II YA. I remember a book that really appealed to me called Slumber of My German Soldier. And anyway, I mean, it seems to me natural now that I picked this book up because from 2006 to 2008, I ended up living in the former GDR in a suburb called Pankow, which is at the end of a train line. And it's this particular suburb was the home of many Stasi and GDR government officials. So somewhat after the fact, ended up slap bang in the middle of Stasiland.
Mm. And do you think that when you were there in Germany, was there much sort of evidence that the wall ever existed?
I think Funder does get this right. I remember being conscious of trying to place the wall as I moved around the East. There's an area not far from where I think Funder is located in that period, 1996 and on, just kind of to the north of Mitte, that is a kind of gap that suggests that this might have been the place where the wall is, but it's a gap. It's not the presence of any kind of particular memorials or presence of the wall itself that suggests that. And I think, though, that Berlin is a city of layers. It's a city of many historical layers, and you're always aware that lots of big things happened here. But it does take it takes a local, or it takes a book to kind of help you find or, I guess, excavate that history.
Yeah. So one of the things we were talking about before we came out here was how, for you guys, this is not just a book of journalism. It's not just a sort of a factual retelling of history. It is a work of literature. It's a work of creative non-fiction. So first of all, I suppose I want to talk about Anna as author and Anna as character, and how do you think those two sort of people are balanced?
Well, maybe we should sort of start by talking about this term creative non-fiction, because I think if there's any kind of take-home message that I have for you today, it is to really stress the fact that while this is a non-fiction book, it's a constructed piece of literature, and therefore needs to be read just as you would read a novel. You need to look for its constructedness, the how it is written as much as the what is said in the book. So creative non-fiction, is this a term you're familiar with? Yeah. So it's, I suppose, to just quickly define it, it's a genre that offers us fact, but told in the style of fiction. And one of the, or a couple of the traits, I suppose, that are quite prominent in Stasiland and in creative non-fiction in general, is this, I suppose, subjectivity and selectivity. So Anna, I think, by putting herself in the book as a character, allows for that selectivity and subjectivity to kind of be naturalised, if you like. Anna as a character is very interesting to watch, I think, and I urge you to students out there to watch where she decides to intervene when she's allowing her subjects to narrate their past. She often tells us, for example, how to react to somebody's story. And I think contrasting the way that she reacts to, say, Julia and Miriam's stories compared with, say, Herr Bock is quite an interesting thing. I think we see quite visceral, physical reaction to the women's stories in Stasiland, but we have her kind of correcting Herr Bock while she's not in his presence in the book. So, I think watching Anna as a character is a really important thing to do when you're analysing this text.
Do you think she's a reliable narrator?
I think she certainly performs reliability. So she's very good at, I suppose, performing the role of the investigative journalist. So we see her taking notes. And we know that she puts a tape recorder on because we're told that tape recorder is there. And I think she performs fairness by putting that advertisement in the newspaper for Stasi men to come and talk to her about their experiences. I think that kind of suggests to us that she's trying to get some kind of balanced account, but maybe that's something we can discuss, whether or not she achieves a balance there.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the gender balance, which you sort of briefly brought up, which I found really interesting in the book, in the way that, on the whole, all of the women who are interviewed were more or less victims of, I suppose in some ways they were all victims of the GDR regime, but the women in particular were very, very much powerless, but most of the men she interviews had power in those situations. Do you think that she, in the way that she is showing these women and men post-GDR, do you think that is a balance that's been corrected?
I was very struck by the fact that women are the victims in this story. Although I think she's trying to recast victims as heroes. I think that's one of her purposes in the tale. She doesn't want to treat them like victims. She does want to give them their moment in the sun, if you like. But and I was struck by how the GDR was masculinised in the book. So there's that very early scene where she's walking around a museum, a now museum, formerly a Stasi headquarters, and the guard there, or cleaner, I think, mentions to her that there's only a toilet for men on this particular floor, the floor of the high officials, and she also tells her that the building stank of old men. They couldn't erase this smell for many years. And what I think's interesting about this is that Anna and her own relationship with Stasi officials is actually mapped onto this. So if you like, Anna becomes another woman who is subject to the treatment of Stasi men. I think her meetings with Stasi men, while sometimes comical, are also moments of danger, really. I mean, she's putting herself at the mercy of these men.
And often confrontational.
Yes, I think, so with, I think it's Herr Christian, she jumps in a black BMW and he drives her down a disused road in the middle of the forest. And then there's that rather sinister encounter later on where she winds up in a house with no lights, and it's late at night and there's no buses, and her Stasi man won't call for a taxi for her. So I think that Anna Funder is actually connecting both that Stasi past and her own experience with Stasi men, and creating this kind of narrative where we do see it in a quite gendered way, male perpetrators and female victims.
And I think a lot of her kind of interactions with just day-to-day bureaucracy reflect that as well, like when she goes to the swimming pool and sort of comes across all of those rules, that I think that is a very deliberate parallel.
Yeah, that moment in the book I think is really important because it's a moment where Funder is stressing her Australianness, and it comes after hearing Julia's story, so the timing of it is quite important. And I think back to this idea of Anna as a character and also the author, I think she kind of plays it both ways. She wants to tell us that she's an insider. She's very keen to tell us that she's spent time in Germany before and after the wall fell, that she has the language under her belt. Very early on in the book, she uses a German idiom to let us know that. She often sort of litters the book with German words that need translation. But I think she's also quite keen to stress her difference as well. And I think for me that swimming scene is sort of about not being one of these people who needs rules, who needs order, who can, I suppose, be direct and act from the gut.
I want to kind of talk about her as an Australian as well, which I think is really important. I know that the book was not particularly well received in former East Germany, and that a lot of people felt very hostile that, some random Australian lady who'd written this book about something that was very, very personal to them. Do you think this book could have been written by a German?
That's a really interesting question. Certainly, Funder thinks that these women would not have told their story to her in quite the detail, perhaps the emotive detail that they did if she had been a local. I think there's certainly evidence in the book that the level of detail these women are willing to give Anna is partly because they realise they need to explain a lot of things to her for her to really kind of get it. One of the criticisms of the book has been that actually the stories that Funder is telling in the book, and these are reviews that have appeared. There was one in the TLS and there was one in a historical journal called Oral History, and both of these reviews suggest that actually Germans were writing books about this particular period of their history, and that this claim that no one is dealing with this history is actually a false one. So I don't know. I mean, we might need a German to answer that properly. But I do think my sense of some Germans is that there is a level of exhaustion around dealing with the past. And I think that is totally understandable. When you think about what has happened in Germany since really unification in the 19th century, Germany has been an epicentre of, cataclysmic political change. And when you have an event like the Holocaust, let alone all of the other things that have happened in the 20th century in a country, it seems to me that dealing with yet another rather dismal, tragic, violent area of your past, you can imagine just the sheer exhaustion of that. But I mean, I do want to say that I think Germans have done pretty well at trying to face their past. In fact, they've invented a word for it, this facing the past. And I mean, Anna, in the book on page 4, mentions this word. You'll remember that she talks about loving the stickle brick language of German, and she lists a whole bunch of German words. And I think it's really interesting to look at those German terms, because I don't think she's just chosen them randomly. I mean, there are many composite words in German. But the last one that she mentions here, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, is actually a word that means coming to terms with the past. There's a whole genre of literature in Germany that is about coming to terms with the past, usually the Holocaust past, but I think it can be generalised to other things too.
And I think that if you had to pick, one central theme for the book, this is the theme is that, the central question is, do you kind of acknowledge the past, and how much acknowledging is healthy and how much is just wallowing or nostalgia, and how much do you try and put it behind you and move forward, and is it healthier to remember or to forget? And do you think that Funder has an answer to that question?
I think it is the central question that the book is asking. And I think it does come out, I mean, its sheer existence suggests that the answer is yes, one must face the past, one must remember. It's important to remember. But I think the problem that Germany faces is that there are many competing histories to remember, and sometimes they actually erase each other. So in the book, just to give you an example, there's the example, Funder gives the example of street names, problematic street names, and their erasure, the way that their names are changed. But she also mentions a building called the Palace der Republik. This was the building of government for the GDR. And Funder talks about it in the book, and she talks about its physical properties. It had sort of orange-coloured glass that was mirrored all around it, and I think it serves as a beautiful kind of metaphor for the watching and surveillance that is all sort of part and parcel of the GDR. But she talks about the fact that the Germans kind of didn't know what to do with it anymore. So this book was published in 2002, and when I was there between the years 2006 and 2008, that decision was made. So what was decided was that the building would be pulled down, and in its place, the building that stood on that site prior to the building of the palace would be rebuilt, and that building was a castle that was put up by the Prussian aristocracy. So you can see, I think in this example, which history do you allow to stand and which history do you erase when they both need to stand in exactly the same spot.
Who do you disenfranchise by doing either of those? Because, covering up the fact that, this whole era of history ever happened is, I suppose it is not fair to the people who suffered through it.
Yes.
Interesting.
I think it did come out in surveys done that people who were from the former East Berlin wanted the building to stay. So when they did run those stats, that's how it turned out. If you want to know what's happening now, apparently the building, the castle that is not yet built. I haven't been back for a number of years, but I believe they've run out of money, and they've postponed the start of this building until 2014. But the palace has been dismantled. It no longer stands there.
Interesting. This kind of a few of the things we've talked about are sort of raised a bit of a central question in terms of both the way that the book is narrated and also sort of the reception of the book. who do you think is Funder's intended audience? Who is she writing this book for?
I don't think it's for Germans. I think that's clear. I think what Funder, whether consciously or unconsciously, taps into here is an audience that craves reality. So I think, this book, published in 2002, is part of this kind of surge of non-fiction writing that I think is at its kind of epoch right now. So there's this real taste for real stories. And it's been argued by various critics that this has something to do with 9/11, that 9/11 is the end of postmodern irony, the end of game playing and fiction, and people want, after 9/11, real issues need to be faced. We need to talk about political issues in our literature, and I think in a way this book is a kind of response, a response to that.
How many parallels do you think there are to be drawn between the GDR and sort of post 9/11 Western society?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? That surveillance is obviously a very big theme in this book, and post 9/11, many of our Western governments brought in quite stringent laws about security. So I think it does have a pertinence that kind of goes beyond Germany and those set of circumstances that it faced after World War II.
And I think probably there's also there's something chilling about sort of thinking about it. They say that in the UK, your average British person is filmed by 70 different security cameras every day, and that it must be so easy, really. Like, you look at a book like this and you think, that could never happen here, what a ridiculous thing. It seems so extreme. But then you sort of look at these sort of bit by bit sort of tightenings of security and restrictions and airport security theatre and all the rest of it, and you think, actually, maybe it would be quite easy just to slip into.
Yes, I think the book is very interested in the way that privacy and I guess personal freedoms are eroded bit by bit. So it might not seem so bad to kind of say where your your friend is having a meeting with another friend. Like, that little piece of information to the Stasi might not seem so big, but cobbled together it actually could give the Stasi information about your friend that could condemn them. And likewise, I think we're quite laissez-faire about the idea of a camera filming us, but perhaps cobbled together with other modes of surveillance, that could be quite a dangerous thing.
So I wanted to talk about some of the contrasts in the book, because I know this is something that you guys, do look at. I suppose one of the biggest kind of contrasts are these ideas of order and freedom and privacy and freedom, and privacy and control, and also I think obedience and disobedience, and the way that both of those are sort of in evidence in the book in both heroic and sort of and villainous ways.
Yeah, I think Anna is very interested in ordinary acts of courage. I don't think she's interested in ideologically motivated acts of courage. So she's interested in people who do things out of a kind of gut instinct for justice. So a good example, I think, is Frau Paul, who chooses against visiting her sick baby in a Western hospital to make sure that she doesn't act as I suppose an accessory to a Stasi operation against someone associated with getting East Germans out of East Berliners out of East Berlin. So I think, yes, I think she's very interested in courage, and I think her new book, All That I Am, is also interested in that particular theme. So this is now the thread that clearly is running through her work. But I don't think she's interested in, I guess, political motivations for that particular courage. In terms of other freedoms, I think, Klaus is an interesting character. I think with him she explores this idea of internal immigration, a notion that East Germans had about, I suppose, keeping a sense of your own privacy, disappearing, if you like, into your own world, your own orbit, and not allowing the politics and surveillance to get to you. And so there is a suggestion that that individual selves might be able to create spheres of freedom for themselves. That said, I think with the women we see how impossible that became. When what is being surveilled is your family life. I think the possibilities for a kind of freedom become quite small.
Yep. And so what are I suppose the moments or the images from this book that really stand out for you?
Well, having had a baby in the last year, I mean, Frau Paul's story really struck me quite strongly this time around, in a way that it didn't back in 2004 when I read it and wasn't even thinking of having a child. I think she made an extraordinary decision. And in fact, a decision that I still don't know. I don't know whether it was right or wrong. And in fact, I think that's the wrong question to ask. I think what the state did was wrong, and putting Frau Paul in a position to be kind of responsible here is wrong. And in a sense, I think Frau Paul is doing that to herself. She also understands that that separation from her son was quite catastrophic. So that for me is quite a strong image this time around. Can I ask you what is an image that sticks with you?
There are a few, I suppose. The idea of the puzzle women I found really, really fascinating, and I think it's a really beautiful parallel with a lot of these stories of people trying to find truth and meaning and sort of sort out the truth from the chaos. Really early on in the book, where she's sort of in that really quite straight non-fictional telling of the fall of the GDR, just the moment where she talks about how the Stasi were all burning all of their documents and that their shredding machines all broke because they'd shredded them so much, that has really struck with me. And I think also Herr Koch's story about the plate, which is, I think, just a completely absurd but also amazing story of kind of courage and just complete frustration as well. Yeah.
The puzzle women, I think, are used very interestingly in the book, because Miriam is being used as the bookends of this tale. So in a way, Funder is creating a sense of resolution through the visit to the puzzle women, who are really, I guess, the people, because they're people, not just women, who are going to come up with an answer for her. And I think what's interesting is that visit offers us resolution, because we get an answer to how long it's going to take for Miriam to find out about exactly what happened to her husband, whether it was suicide, whether it was a murder, whether his body was in a coffin, whether it wasn't, whether he was cremated. So I think we get a sense of how long that's going to take, but of course Funder the character cannot tell Miriam exactly how long that's going to be once she finds out. So Miriam herself doesn't get a resolution. So I think that's quite an interesting deployment of those women here. The latest news on puzzle women, I believe they are using computers now, so it might not take 375 years for us to get all of those answers.
It was also an image that was also used in Argo, which won Best Picture at the Oscars last night, as they have small children doing the same thing.
Yeah, that's right.
Which sort of jumped out at me when I watched it on the weekend. All right, I think we are about ready for some questions from the floor. So if any of you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. There's one right there.
Why do you think there was some opposition to this book when it was published in Germany?
So the story is that 23 publishers rejected it, and then it was published by an independent publisher, and that Funder, when she went around Germany on a book tour, was often accosted by particularly East Germans asking her what authority did she have to speak about their history. Perhaps that's a reasonable question. Her response was always, whose authority should I seek? You know, who's going to give me this permission? I come from a country where I don't need to seek that kind of permission. And I think that's a very good response. But nonetheless, I don't know how we would feel if someone foreign came in and, I don't know, criticised our asylum seeker policy, perhaps. Even if we might ourselves not feel too good about it. I think another reason might be that it's history in the making at the moment. It's still quite new. You know, it's past, but it's within my own living memory. I remember the wall coming down. I was in Year 11 at the time. I even wrote an essay on it, which I managed to dig up, and I read on the tram on the way in. And I remember asking my father to ask the news agent to keep the billboard, and I still have that at home in my little box, like Hagen's box.
You nerd.
So I think, you know, this is fresh history and it's still being written. And I think, I don't know if you know this, but page 84 of at least my edition, it might have been removed from yours, was actually taken out by there was legal action by a bunch of Stasi men who are mentioned in the book, the Insider Committee. They launched legal action against the book, and this information about what these ex-Stasi men have been doing to intimidate people was actually removed from subsequent editions.
It is. It's not in here.
It's not in there?
There's no names anyway. She talks about the Insider Committee. But
yeah, right. So I think there are people patrolling the history, you know, people who are involved in this history obviously have reasons to try to make that history reflect their own particular sense of the reality.
And I think also it does come back to that question of intended audience. I don't think that she intended it to be a book for Germans. I think that she intended in some ways to be a translator between this world and our world, and that as somebody who has a foot in each, that she can sort of communicate to us effectively the intensity of these times.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Who else has a question? Yep, down the front.
Is this working? Oh, yes. Just to follow up on that last comment, I was at a conference at Monash last week about translating, and it did seem that it raised a lot of interesting subject matter. I suppose in relation to what you're saying now is the fact that she's an Australian who is coming to another country's historic and political situation from her own strong beliefs, I take it, and that she therefore writes, as a writer, she's what you could say biased before she starts by her own beliefs, so that questions of feminism and the wrongness of the communist empire, the communist state, are part of her inherent, and so she isn't a truthful, in that sense, writer of the other person's history, because she's coming from such a different history, and she therefore swings it, as presumably you'd agree she's done in this book, towards her own background.
I think that's a fair point. She, at one part of the book, describes herself as an eye on this on the ceiling, in a ceiling corner, and I don't think she's an eye in the ceiling corner at all. I think she's very much placed within the story and is very, very subjective. Yeah, I think, I think some of the criticisms have been around her sort of unremittingly bleak portrait of this world. I mean, people did have lives in the GDR, and we have the drunks at the end of the book stressing that to her, you know, and kind of telling her about some of the positive things that did occur. You know, cheaper prices, no homelessness, what have you. And it could be argued, I think, that while the book does mention this other side, it certainly puts the emphasis on the more traumatic, on the more violent aspects of that past.
I think it's often really helpful with any kind of literature, but with this kind in particular, is to kind of look at the levels of ideology that are going on. That, you know, there's always the surface ideology, which is what the writer is telling you. But then after that, there is an implicit ideology, which is the author's own kind of unspoken ideological beliefs. And those are things that an author cannot hide really entirely, that they will always come up. So you're right that she is, you know, she's a small L liberal, that, you know, she comes from Australia. She is obviously a big fan of, you know, equal rights for ladies and democracy and, you know, all the other things that we kind of just take for granted. And then there also is like a level of cultural ideology, and that is where her Australianness comes through as well.
And I think you might then see, you know, her positioning of herself as a character, as a kind of honesty, you know, as a kind of, I guess, fessing up to the fact that she is telling this story from her own particular point of view.
Great. Who else?
I suppose for me, one of the things that made this book so powerful was the domestic element. You know, the interviews very much take place within a setting where in somebody's lounge, you know, there's a very mundane kind of domestic element which contrasts with this, you know, these political machinations which really always seem to occur in a very other place. Do you know, people are always having to go to a particular building to get a slip to get permission to go and do this. So I found that, you know, that contrast between that intimate domestic space and these very isolated political kind of restrictions and administrations are a really interesting part of the novel, of the book.
I think, yeah, that's a nice observation. I think part of that presentation is that we are being asked to see that these women are offering their stories freely, you know, over a meal of salmon pasta, or you know, allowing Anna to sleep over, you know, in their home, Miriam at the end of the book. And I think it's also interesting that we go to the houses of some of the Stasi men as well, and we kind of time travel when we do that, because she's very good at observing the way that their homes look, and they look like they're stuck in time. Watch the use of Anna's kind of perception of colour in the book. We usually end up in a brown room when we go and visit a Stasi officer, and this kind of, I guess, is this Alice in Wonderland element of the book. Anna falls down the rabbit hole and finds herself in the GDR when she goes to visit one of these men in their own home. They've managed to kind of preserve a little bit of the GDR inside their own home.
And I think that also really plays into the depiction of gender in the book as well, is that when she visits these men, they have these very kind of like oppressive homes where she obviously does not feel comfortable for various reasons, you know, whether it's because she's being screamed at or, you know, not really being allowed to leave. But then when she speaks to women, they usually share a meal together, and she seems a lot more comfortable and a lot, and it feels like a domestic space and not like, you know, a living museum.
Yeah, it's a sharing, isn't it, with the women, and this could be to mitigate the charge that you know, Anna is doing exactly what the Stasi have done to these women, which is, I suppose, interrogate them, right? So I think we need, or she needs us to see that these stories are given freely, and that there is a friendship there. This is not just a kind of you know, funder takes all and gives nothing back type of relationship. And so, yeah, I think perhaps because we're given these you know, slithers of domestic life intermixed with sort of this dredging of memory, perhaps that's part of the reason for that presentation.
Yep, there's one over there.
Just some observations. My daughter, who now lives in Paris and teaches at the international school, but before that she taught for 6 years at the school in Düsseldorf, in the international school there, and they taught that book. And also I've just recently been to Berlin, and I was surprised how, and I was in that part of Berlin, how comfortable they are with it all, and how the people, the young people in particular, are so helpful and all together. I just couldn't. It seems a lovely city, and there seems to be none of this aggression or anger that, for instance, the German art has. So just observation, nothing.
That's mostly my own experience of Germany and Berlin too. I mean, Berlin is a very particular city in Germany. I think it's a very quite relaxed city. That said, I remember I taught in Berlin in this suburb Pankow where I lived, and my dean, the dean of my college, university, he used to always tell me that there were curtain twitchers in Pankow, that there were many former GDR officials in the area, and that they were always peeping out their windows. So perhaps that element is there, but I think the city that you visit as a tourist doesn't bear that up.
I think it's one of the things that makes the book feel in some ways like a novel, like a dystopian novel, is that the recovery of Germany has been so extraordinary after, you know, a 20th century that was, you know, kind of pretty rubbish from beginning to end, and that it is just a completely remarkable recovery.
It's an incredible success when you think about a revolution happening in 1989 and a reunification in 1990 and all that entailed. That there have been moments of erasure is not surprising, and perhaps have actually helped that reunification process.
Yep, at the back.
I just wanted to comment. I found the front cover of the book really fascinating, and I just wondered if you would comment on the imagery of that, perhaps.
I had to confess before that I didn't read this book for years when it came out because of the cover, because I thought it was about, you know, taking drugs in nightclubs or something, because it just seemed to have so little to do with the subject matter. I'm still quite puzzled by it, I have to admit.
Yeah, we were discussing this very topic while we were waiting to come here, and I can just give you the observation that when I worked in that bookshop in Sydney in 2002, you know, Funder hadn't previously published book. This is her first book, and there was confusion about her being this particular woman on the cover. You know, when you look at the picture on the back, it could be the same person, and I think actually it seems to me that the book might have sold on the basis of this cover and of the possibility that this might be Anna Funder. It's a very strange cover, and yeah, it doesn't. I think I agree with Lili here. It doesn't seem to me to bear out anything that's actually within the book itself.
It is a very striking image, though. All right, we've got time for one last question.
Thank you. I'm interested in the role of Funder as a lawyer. And I guess in particular, it seems to me her writing is obsessed with the acts of the state on the citizen in both Stasiland and also All That I Am. So, I guess I'm after your thoughts on the writer as both a lawyer but also perhaps a judge of her characters.
We have some good Australian writers who are ex-lawyers, don't we? Nam Lee is springing to mind. Yes, I mean, I think Funder doesn't perform as a lawyer within the pages of this book. In fact, I think she often performs as an ingenue, like somebody who's kind of new to it, actually. And she mentions that she worked for a TV station, but I don't know if she actually mentions that she was a lawyer inside the actual book. Lili, do you have any thoughts on this?
I don't know. I think that she certainly tries to. I think she, in some ways, is almost two lawyers. In some ways, is that she is providing, or at least she is trying to provide balance, and particularly in terms of some of like the ethical and moral decisions that are made, and like the contrast between Frau Paul deciding not to inform and sacrificing, the right to see her child, versus her coach's choice of wife and life, are in some ways opposite choices, but I think are viewed equally sympathetically. I don't know. All right, that's it. We've run out of time. Thank you guys so much for coming.